Shalom around the world. Thank you for joining us. It's a delight today to be here with Beatrice Weber, who is a mother of 10 and grandmother of 12. Beatrice left her arranged marriage and her Hasidic lifestyle in the process. Deprived of a basic education, Beatrice went on to earn a BA and an MBA. She is a trained interfaith minister, public speaker, and a passionate advocate for Hasidic youth to receive a sound basic education so they can contribute meaningfully to their communities. She's also a writer and activist and is the senior advisor of Yafed, a nonprofit which advocates for education justice in the Hasidic and Haredi community. Beatrice, thanks so much for joining.
Oh, such a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
So just to start, tell us a little bit about the mission of Yafed.
So Yafet's mission is to ensure that Hasidic and Haredi children in New York State receive a substantial basic education, which means receive an education in science, math, social studies, reading, spelling.
Awesome. And how many children would you say are impacted by this issue?
You know, we're doing a study looking at the exact numbers, but it's definitely in high tens of thousands. We're looking at 65,000 plus across the state. Now, there are more children than that in Hasidic and Haredi schools, but those are the children who are most impacted because there is a range, right? Some Hasidic and Haredi schools do provide a basic education and many don't. So when we look at the numbers, we look at the ones that are not providing the education.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I think of this as a New York issue. Is this just an issue in New York or is this an international issue?
This is an issue everywhere where there is a large concentration of Hasidic Jews. So it's mostly, you find this issue here in New York and in Israel. There are pockets of this issue in England and London as well, in Montreal as well. So it's definitely not unique to New York. The reason why it's so significant in New York is because of the large number of Hasidic and Haredi Jews who live here.
Now, I'm often in circles that take for granted their education. People are like, oh, I hated school. It was so boring. I didn't learn anything in chemistry or geometry, or college was a waste of time. We just partied, But like, what's actually the impact of a lack of education for individuals and for the community as a whole?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because it's such an important question. Because I think if people don't understand what exactly is going on in these Hasidic schools, it's easy to put your own experience on that. When we talk about children not receiving an education, what we mean is, and I experienced that with my own children, is that they are not reading on a second or third grade level. Their teachers are not reading on a third grade level. Sometimes you have conversations about what methodology of reading to teach. Well, these children aren't receiving a reading in any educational methodology. You're talking about children who, as adults, cannot do a long division or can't figure out how to do that, cannot write an email that comprises of 3 full sentences. So you're talking about a real handicap that for many of them precludes them from ever moving forward. Now, some who are very bright can move ahead and as an adult make up for education they lost, but a large percentage of people in the world, not unique to the Hasidic community, if they have not received education in developmentally appropriate stages, will not be able to catch up later on.
So that's very powerful and very terrifying. If you're comfortable sharing personally, how have you been impacted by this issue?
So mostly by the fact that none of my sons got a high school diploma. Fingers crossed for my little one who's 11. I'm still hopeful that, he's attending a school now where he'll have that opportunity. But my other sons did not receive a high school diploma, and not because they weren't bright or weren't capable. It's just the schools that they went to did not offer it. My ex-husband as well did not receive. And I want you to understand how this impacts their Jewish education as well. I'll never forget my ex-husband. We moved to Israel when I was 18, newly married, and he was in a yeshiva with boys who had gone to Haredi schools that did provide them with a high school diploma. Now it came to learning Masechta Sukkah, right? So they knew the geometry and the mathematical equations. My ex-husband was clueless on how to approach, and he was kind of jealous of those kids who did have the background and could approach a mathematical concept in Gemara, in the Talmud, in a way that made sense. He also learned how to speak English there in Israel, but that's a whole nother conversation. But it really handicaps these young men. So seeing my boys, some of them are staying long-term and learning. So, okay, whatever, that's a life choice. But the ones who want to go to work, their employment options are so limited.
Yeah, that's so powerful. So the problem is huge. The problem is clear. You can't integrate into society. You can't integrate into the workforce. That hurts financially. That hurts families. And there's so many barriers to fulfilling basic human needs when you're not given this education. So we could talk about the problem all day, and we only scratch the surface, of course. But what's the solution?
So I want to make it really clear that Yafet's mission is not about changing a culture, not about changing tradition. There is a way to provide an education for these children in their schools and in their community. I'm happy to say that over the last couple of months in Israel, we have seen some movement in some Haredi communities towards this effort. I also want to say the girls are receiving this education in their schools. Many of these Hasidic boys, the girls will be receiving an education that gives them a high school diploma. So there is this discrepancy. So it is possible.
Sorry to cut you off. Is that because the men will learn and the women will work, so they realize that women need it?
Partially because of that, yes. There's a higher expectations of what the boys need to learn. They need to learn more. Every moment that they're not learning is considered a waste of time. So there's a lot more pressure on the boys to do more of the Talmud and Torah learning. But for the girls, that's okay. And the girls also take over much of the household responsibilities. I worked at a clinic in the Hasidic community for years. You would have young men needing to bring in their wives or their mothers to help them speak to the doctor to say what was hurting them, to fill out the registration form. So the women, fill that role. So I want to be clear. The New York State curriculum, which is what we're talking about here in New York State, provides for the religious sensitivity and the cultural sensitivity. You can have a absolutely compliant curriculum that is religiously and culturally sensitive. For instance, you can skip out everything about evolution. You can skip out everything about sex ed. Now, whether you like that or not, that's a conversation for a different time. But it can be done. And at Yafet, it's really important for us that people understand that this is not about pulling people away from a community, pulling people away from a culture, but rather how can people within their community, within their schools, actually receive the education that they're supposed to.
Wow. Yes. So going back to the gender comment for a second, do we have data to know if there's more women or men leaving the community? Or do you have a hunch?
I believe it's more men.
Oh, okay, interesting. Which actually makes because if part of the fear is getting the secular education means I'm going to leave because that's my kind of exit door, actually the data might be the opposite.
I believe so. And if you think about the Haredi community, where it's about 50-50 in terms of the education, right? So you'll have kids who are, getting their high school diploma, and maybe they're going to learn for a few years afterwards, and then perhaps later on going to college. I don't think there's a higher rate of people leaving at all. So I don't think there's a correlation at all.
Right. Right.
In fact, some people end up leaving because they want an education so badly, and they can't get it within their community. And it's almost like wanting to get your high school diploma is considered like so rebellious when it shouldn't be.
Right.
And many of these children, their grandparents and great-grandparents back in Europe, those kids spoke the language of their country, wrote the language of their country, went to schools that provided them with an education. So there's nothing really innovative or modern about this idea.
Yeah. So here at Uri Tzedek, we are interested not just in learning about issues, but empowering the community to figure out how they can act and trying to make it really easy for busy people to act. How can people concerned about this? I mean, who wouldn't be concerned about people being robbed the basic human right of education? How can people concerned about this get involved?
So we have our website, Yafed, YAFFED.org, where they can sign up. And we regularly send out newsletters with actions that people can take. This past a couple of months, we had to deal with a lot of legislative and political action that was being taken behind the scenes to push back the work that we've done. So over the last decade, we've done tremendous work in terms of clarifying what needs to be implemented in these schools, how it should be implemented. I won a case against my son's school, which really defined for Hasidic schools how they need to teach. So there's a lot of work that Yafet has done over the last 10 years to move this issue forward. And over the last couple of months, we were dealing with a lot of political work to push that back years. When we had our supporters making phone calls, reaching out to their representatives, it really made a difference. So there's many ways, to get involved politically, to support our work financially. As always, our lobby days where we go up there. And just speaking about this issue, unfortunately, there are those who want to look at this issue as something that they don't need to concern themselves about, that it's not important for them. But this is an issue that impacts all of us. First of all, as Jewish people, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, how can we look away from the fact that you have young children who are being deprived of their basic rights? But it also impacts us as New Yorkers, where there are so many tax dollars that are going to support these schools, support families who can't support themselves, so much charity that's going to a community of bright people. If they would have the opportunity, they'd be fine. And then as Jews who value education, education is such an important value to so many of us. Like, do we want to be seen as a community that doesn't want education, when in fact that's the actual antithesis of who we are as a people?
Very nice, very nice. So, as a pluralist, I have a respect for different faiths. I have a respect for different denominations, Reform, conservative, modern Orthodox, Hasidic or Haredi, secular. I don't want to really tell the Reform Jews how to live. I don't want to tell Hasidim how to live. How do we balance speaking about such a pressing issue while also being sensitive to being an outsider to that community for a culture, even if we have personal critiques that we also want to publicly respect?
One of the challenges is that the people who speak against wanting to implement education are very often, elected officials or people who have been trained, leaders in the community, not the individuals. The individual people in the community who often will call me and tell me how they feel and think very much want change. So it's really about how do we get past that barrier of the leadership that doesn't really want you to speak to those people in the community and find out what's going on. So when, we at Yafed was founded by people from the community, it's supported by people from the community, like, trust them. Oftentimes people will look at the activists that speak up about these issues in the community and say, oh, they're just the people who left, or they're just the troublemakers. But in fact, it's they are giving voice to all those tens of thousands of people who can't speak up in the community.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's important that we see this as not. There are some people on the top who are malicious about this and know what they're doing. But for the most part, it's a sensitivity to the culture, a sensitivity to the way of life, and a concern for those children, because those children need us to speak up for them.
Yeah. So how did we get here? Like, why are the schools the way they are?
I think that's a great question, because as I mentioned before, like, back in the day, when I say back in the day, I mean back, my grandparents are from Hungary and from Poland. Like, those kids were going to school and speaking the language of the country. Anybody who knows what Williamsburg was like back in the 60s will tell you the language on the street was not Yiddish. It was Hungarian. Like, they were all speaking the language of the country they came from. But what happened was, when they started schools here, there was no real oversight of the schools. There was a law, 100 years old, that says that if you start a private school, that's fine. It just needs to be equivalent to what's being taught in a public school, right? Basically, open your own school. And that was, back when the Catholics and the Protestants. So that was way before, the Jews arrived to New York. And actually, the first schools that were started for Jewish Haredi people in New York were on a very high standard. If you look back historically, but after the 50s, when you had those huge influx of Hasidic communities, they started opening up their own schools. And their attitude was very much isolationist, very much fear, very much let's do this on our own. And the government had gotten so used to allowing these private schools to just do whatever they want that they just continued. Nobody came in and said, okay, these are actually the requirements. These are what you had to do. And later on, we hear like in the 80s, there were actually under the table deals being done between the school boards and the community to kind of have these little deals done that the lawmakers should look away from what had by then been recognized as this is blatantly wrong. In the community, it's really, really hard to speak up. When you're in the community, you rely on the community, for work, for where you send your kids to school, for where you live, for everything. To speak up against something that's so commonly done in the community is almost tantamount to I mean, you're literally cutting yourself off from all your basic needs. So there's nobody really in the community speaking up. Then the politicians who appreciate a vote that they can count on don't want to speak up as well. So between the two, you end up with a community it's reached astronomical proportions in a way that I don't think anybody ever imagined, but in a way that's so harmful, to the individuals in the community, to the rest of the Jewish community and the rest of New York.
Yeah. So maybe a last question for you. You're so articulate and passionate, and I've learned so much from you. How do you respond to the critics and to the critiques? Those who say, you know what, it's really not a problem. Our community's doing fine, and these rabble-rousers on the outside should mind their own business, and respect our community to manage itself, and whatever other common critiques you hear. How do you respond to this?
I mean, there's so many different ways to look at it. So number one, we're okay. A lot of times that's being saying, oh, didn't you see that rich person from the Hasidic community? You see, like he didn't get an education and he's doing okay. Well, I'll talk to you about the millions and millions of dollars of food packages that are delivered into the Hasidic community for every holiday, for Pesach. You have lines and lines of people lining up for food. Don't tell me a community like that is doing well. You may hear, your Haredi politician coming and telling you that everything is fine. But I know about that woman who's babysitting double time and her husband is teaching full day in a school and they're barely making ends meet because they're trying to support their family. So, from like economically speaking, it is a community that supports itself. So you're not going to see people going hungry or homeless, but there's a lot of the haves and have-nots. So you have that discrepancy. And then number two is it's the right of every child to get an education. It's the right by law. There's a New York State law, and most countries have a law that, of a requirement of education, but it's also a Jewish value, to make sure that children get what they deserve to have a successful life. And, we can go on, every father is supposed to teach their son to have a parnasa. What's happening now is when the Gemara says that if you don't, the chance of them, doing things illegal can happen is unfortunately what we see so much where not being honest in your financial dealings has become an acceptable lifestyle.
Yeah, you look at the list of slumlords, you've got Shlomis and Avrahams, and it's embarrassing.
It's the saddest thing. But if you think about it, you're not seeing doctors and lawyers coming from this community. Why not? These are bright people who, if given the opportunity, would excel, but they're being put in an impossible situation.
Yeah. Friends, here at Uri Tzedek, we are here to combat poverty and injustice, whether we're doing that for immigrants at the border who need a shower, who need a helping hand, whether we're doing that for other groups that we're allies to. We should also be willing to do that within our own Jewish community, to make sure, as Beatrice said so articulately, the concept of arvus, kol Yisrael, or even zeh b'zeh, that we're responsible for one another, take care of each other. Sometimes that happens with a handout, and sometimes that happens with pressure and with legislation. And this is a case, as we've learned, that there is a community that is being held back from being able to survive and thrive in the general U.S. economy. And this is an opportunity for us to ensure that the basic human right of education, something that Jews should be so proud of, a commitment to education, that we make sure every child has that in the community. Beatrice, thank you so much for all your work and for all you shared with us today.
Thank you.